Don't leave him. We don't even know if anyone is coming for him. The woman's desperate voice cracked through Ryan Carter's headset just before the transmission dissolved into static. Then came the reply from Mission Control, quiet, exhausted, and impossible to forget. If we stay, everyone dies. The signal vanished. Ryan stared at the dead comm panel for half a second, his hand frozen over the controls of the escape pod. He had spent 12 years solving impossible problems as an aerospace rescue engineer, but there was nothing left to fix this time. The survey ship Horizon had already broken apart above the planet, scattering burning debris across an endless sea of clouds. Warning lights flashed red across the tiny cockpit. Altitude dropping. Heat shield compromised. Manual control unavailable. Ryan let out one slow breath. Come on, just give me one good landing. The pod answered by shaking so violently his shoulders slammed into the sidewall. Outside the narrow viewport, the sky glowed deep orange, streaked with unfamiliar lightning that danced sideways instead of down. Mountains pierced the clouds like black knives, and forests stretched for hundreds of miles beneath them. None of it appeared on any star chart he had ever studied. Whatever this planet was, humanity had never set foot here. The impact came without warning. Metal screamed. Dirt exploded against the hull. The pod bounced once, twice, then carved a trench nearly 80 feet long before crashing to a stop against the roots of a towering tree whose glowing branches reached higher than most skyscrapers back on Earth. Silence settled over everything except the ticking sound of cooling metal. Ryan blinked several times before realizing he was still breathing. His forehead throbbed. His left leg protested the moment he tried to move it. Well, he muttered to nobody. That could have gone smoother. Emergency systems flickered weakly to life. Oxygen stable. Cabin pressure safe. External temperature 78 degrees Fahrenheit. Atmospheric analysis compatible. Ryan almost laughed. After surviving re-entry, the universe had decided to be polite enough to provide breathable air. He grabbed the emergency backpack, a water purifier, a compact survival toolkit, medical supplies, 3 protein packs, and the locator beacon. He pressed the activation switch. Nothing. He tried again. Still nothing. The display remained black. Seriously? He removed the battery, reseated it, and tried one last time. Dead. His rescue beacon had been fried during the descent. Nobody knew where he was. Nobody could even start looking. Ryan climbed out through the damaged hatch and stopped cold. The air smelled fresh, carrying hints of rain and unfamiliar flowers. Strange birds with shimmering wings circled overhead, singing notes unlike anything he had heard on Earth. Giant blue vines wrapped around crystal-colored trees, while floating spores drifted lazily through shafts of sunlight. Beautiful, completely alien. He checked his watch automatically before remembering that Earth time no longer meant much out here. His stomach tightened. Somewhere beyond those endless forests, predators almost certainly hunted. Somewhere above the clouds, pieces of the horizon were still falling. Somewhere back home, people would assume he never made it out. He swallowed hard, forcing the thought away. Panic never fixed broken machinery. It would not fix this either. He scanned the horizon, spotted higher ground about half a mile away, and adjusted the straps on his backpack. One step at a time, he whispered. Find water. Find shelter. Stay alive until somebody finds you. He had barely taken 10 steps before the quiet forest changed. Every bird stopped singing at once. Even the wind seemed to disappear. Ryan slowly turned toward the tree line. He could not see anyone, but every instinct he had ever trusted told him exactly the same thing. Someone was already watching him. Here is the requested continuation as a reusable draft. Ryan kept his eyes on the trees without reaching for the survival knife strapped to his pack. Every instinct told him that making the first move would be a mistake. The forest remained perfectly still for several long seconds before a faint rustle drifted through the glowing vines. Then another. Shapes appeared between the trunks, moving with surprising discipline instead of the reckless curiosity he expected from wild creatures. There were at least a dozen of them. They stepped into the open one by one, carrying elegant spears crafted from dark crystal and polished wood. Their armor looked as though it had grown from living plants instead of being forged in a factory. Ryan slowly raised both hands. Easy. I am not looking for trouble. The translator clipped to his collar remained silent. Whatever language they spoke, it was far beyond the device's damaged memory banks. The women studied him without saying a word. Their skin carried a faint blue glow beneath the afternoon light, and intricate silver markings flowed across their arms like rivers. They looked strong, alert, and completely confident on terrain that still felt overwhelming to him. One of them stepped closer than the others. She appeared older, her posture calm rather than aggressive. She pointed toward the ruined escape pod in the distance, then toward Ryan, asking a question he could not understand. He answered with the oldest form of communication he knew. He pointed to himself. Ryan. Then he pointed toward the smoking wreck. Ship. Finally he shrugged and spread his hands. The older woman exchanged glances with the others. Several whispered among themselves before one younger hunter laughed quietly, shaking her head as though the answer had confirmed something ridiculous. Ryan caught only one word repeated several times. Koresh. Whatever it meant, they all seemed to recognize it. The older woman walked around him carefully, inspecting his backpack, boots, and weathered rescue jacket. She reached toward the locator beacon hanging from his belt. Ryan gently held up one finger. Broken. He pressed the switch again. Nothing happened. Then he gave a helpless smile. Trust me. I wish it worked. To his surprise, the woman seemed to understand more from his expression than his words. She nodded slowly before motioning for two hunters to examine the damaged beacon. They turned it over with obvious curiosity, whispering back and forth while Ryan watched. Nobody tried to take his supplies. Nobody pointed a weapon directly at him. They were cautious, not cruel. That realization settled some of the fear growing in his chest. The silence finally broke when a distant horn echoed across the valley. Every woman instantly looked toward the western ridge. Their calm expressions changed. It was not panic. It was concern mixed with urgency. The older woman spoke sharply, and the group immediately formed a protective circle around Ryan instead of surrounding him like a prisoner. He frowned. That was unexpected. One of the younger hunters gestured for him to follow. Ryan hesitated for only a second. Staying alone in an alien forest with no food source beyond 3 emergency bars suddenly seemed like a much worse option. All right, he said quietly. I guess I am with you. They traveled for nearly an hour through winding trails hidden beneath enormous roots and glowing ferns. Ryan noticed something strange. The paths had clearly been maintained for generations, yet he never saw a single man among them. Every scout, every guard, every worker carrying woven baskets or tending strange blue crops was a woman. Children peeked from behind stone walls with wide, curious eyes before quickly disappearing again. As the village came into view, Ryan slowed to a stop. At its center stood a massive carved stone shaped like a crown reaching toward the sky. Beneath it, dozens of villagers had already gathered. None of them looked surprised to see the stranger from the stars. They looked as though they had been waiting for him. Ryan could feel every pair of eyes following him as he stepped into the village. Nobody spoke to him directly. Mothers quietly guided their children a little closer behind them, not out of fear but caution. Older women studied him the way experienced mechanics studied an unfamiliar machine, looking for clues before deciding whether it was useful or dangerous. Ryan had seen that same expression during emergency rescue operations back on Earth. People did not trust strangers until strangers gave them a reason to be trusted. He could not blame them. The older woman who had first approached him spoke a few calm words to the crowd before pointing toward a small stone building near the edge of the settlement. She motioned for Ryan to follow. He nodded without arguing. Inside, the room was simple but surprisingly comfortable. A woven bed rested against one wall. Clay containers held fresh water. The open window overlooked the surrounding forest, where enormous glowing leaves gently swayed in the afternoon breeze. It looked less like a prison and more like a guest room whose door happened to have 2 guards standing outside. Ryan sat down carefully and rubbed his sore leg. Well, he sighed to himself. At least I am still alive. A few minutes later, the older woman returned carrying a wooden bowl filled with steaming vegetables and something that resembled roasted mushrooms. She placed it on the table between them before pointing at herself. Naiva. Ryan smiled. Ryan. She repeated it slowly. Ryan. He nodded. That is right. For the first time since the crash, someone smiled back at him. It was brief, but genuine. They spent nearly an hour exchanging simple words through gestures. Ryan pointed at water. Naiva repeated the local word. She pointed at the ceiling, then the ground, then the nearby trees. He repeated every sound as best he could. Sometimes she laughed quietly when he pronounced something completely wrong. It reminded him of helping his niece learn English years ago. The moment almost made him forget how alone he really was. As evening settled across the village, Ryan heard distant voices gathering outside. Curious, he stepped toward the doorway. One of the guards gently crossed her spear in front of him before shaking her head. Ryan immediately backed away. Fair enough, he said. Your village, your rules. Through the window, he could see dozens of villagers standing around the massive stone crown in the center of the square. Several elders carried glowing crystals, while others raised their hands toward the darkening sky. The ceremony felt ancient, practiced over countless generations. Ryan noticed something else. Every single face belonged to a woman or a young girl. Not one adult man appeared anywhere. The realization finally settled into his mind. This was not coincidence. This society had been living without men for a very long time. Later that night, Naiva returned carrying a small carved tablet. She pointed toward the stone crown outside, then traced the outline of a star falling from the sky. Finally, she pointed directly at Ryan before placing her hand over her heart. He frowned, trying to understand. You think I came from there? She nodded. Then she carefully drew another symbol beneath the falling star. It looked remarkably similar to a crown. Ryan stared at it for several seconds before shaking his head with an awkward laugh. No, you have the wrong guy. I fix rescue aircraft. I am definitely not king material. Naiva did not argue. She simply folded the tablet, placed it beside him, and quietly left the room. Long after she was gone, Ryan remained awake staring at the carving. Outside, the village slowly fell silent beneath unfamiliar stars. Somewhere deep in the forest, a distant horn echoed once again. This time, every light in the village disappeared almost instantly, as though everyone already knew exactly what that sound meant. Ryan barely slept. Every unfamiliar sound beyond the window pulled him awake. Branches creaked overhead. Strange insects hummed somewhere in the darkness. Twice he reached for the flashlight clipped to his belt before remembering he needed to conserve every bit of battery. By sunrise, he had accepted one uncomfortable truth. Nobody from Earth was coming today. Maybe not tomorrow either. If he wanted to survive long enough to be rescued, he would have to stop thinking like a stranded passenger and start thinking like an engineer solving the biggest problem of his life. As he stepped outside, the village was already busy. Women carried woven baskets filled with fruit. Young girls practiced with short wooden staffs under the watchful eyes of older instructors. Others repaired fishing nets beside a narrow stream flowing through the center of the settlement. Ryan quietly watched the rhythm of their morning. It reminded him of small mountain towns back in Colorado. Different people, different world, somehow the same routines. Naiva approached carrying a small cup filled with warm herbal tea. She pointed toward his injured leg before raising an eyebrow. Ryan took a few careful steps. Better, he said with a grateful smile. Still hurts, but I can work. The word work seemed familiar enough. She nodded and motioned for him to follow. They stopped beside a large stone structure where several women struggled with a heavy water wheel connected to a series of carved channels. The wheel turned unevenly before locking in place with a loud crack. Frustrated voices rose around it. Ryan crouched beside the mechanism almost automatically. Years of rescue engineering had taught him to notice patterns before problems. He studied the cracked axle, the worn bearings, and the twisted support beam. Nothing about the design was primitive. In fact, whoever built it understood mechanical principles surprisingly well. They simply lacked one small reinforcement where repeated stress had weakened the frame. Ryan looked toward Naiva. May I? She hesitated before slowly stepping aside. Ryan opened his survival toolkit and removed a compact carbon fiber repair clamp from the emergency equipment. It had originally been designed to stabilize damaged aircraft panels until permanent repairs could be made. After a few measurements, he fitted the clamp around the cracked section, tightened it with a handheld driver, and reinforced the beam using braided plant fibers already lying nearby. Less than 20 minutes later, he gently pushed the wheel forward. It rotated smoothly. Water immediately rushed through the channels toward nearby gardens. Conversation stopped. Ryan looked around awkwardly. It is only temporary, he explained, knowing nobody understood the words. You will need a stronger replacement eventually. The younger women crowded closer, pointing at the repair with obvious curiosity. One carefully touched the clamp before looking at Ryan with wide eyes. Another whispered something that made several others nod. Ryan noticed they were no longer keeping quite as much distance from him. Across the square, however, not everyone looked impressed. A tall warrior wearing dark armor stepped forward, her expression cold and unreadable. She examined the repaired wheel, then shifted her attention directly to Ryan. Unlike the others, she did not smile or whisper. She simply folded her arms and spoke sharply to Naiva. The conversation grew tense. Ryan could not understand the language, but he recognized disagreement when he saw it. Naiva answered calmly. The warrior shook her head. Finally, she pointed first at Ryan, then toward the distant forest beyond the village walls. Ryan had the unmistakable feeling she was suggesting he should leave. Before anyone could respond, a deep horn echoed from somewhere beyond the trees. Every conversation ended instantly. The armored warrior turned toward the forest. Her confidence disappeared for the first time. Ryan followed everyone's gaze. Far beyond the tree line, a slow column of gray smoke was rising into the morning sky, much closer than it had been the night before. The smoke continued climbing into the bright morning sky until even the youngest children noticed it. Whatever confidence the village had shown only minutes earlier quietly disappeared. Ryan watched groups of women gather near the center of the settlement, speaking faster than before. Some carried supplies into underground storage rooms, while others secured doors and moved livestock behind heavy stone walls. Nobody screamed. Nobody panicked. They simply moved with the efficiency of people who had practiced this routine many times. Ryan recognized that look immediately. It was the same expression he had seen on wildfire crews in Colorado just before evacuation orders were given. They already knew what the smoke meant. Naiva hurried toward him, motioning for him to stay close. She spoke several quick sentences before realizing he still could not understand. Taking a stick, she knelt in the dirt and drew a simple map. A circle represented the village. Another mark several miles away became the source of the smoke. Then she drew a line connecting them. Finally, she made a sharp motion with her hand, moving toward the village. Ryan nodded slowly. Whatever is out there, it is coming here. Her eyes widened with relief. Somehow he had understood. Before either of them could continue, the armored warrior from earlier approached with several experienced hunters beside her. She pointed directly at Ryan, then toward the forest, clearly repeating her argument that he should leave before whatever danger was approaching arrived. Ryan could not understand the words, but the meaning was obvious. He was still an outsider. Naiva calmly answered her. The discussion grew longer. Several village elders eventually joined them. Ryan stood quietly, refusing to interrupt. Back home, he had learned something important during emergency operations. When people were scared, forcing your opinion into the conversation rarely helped. Listening usually did. After several minutes, the argument ended without either side looking satisfied. The armored warrior walked away, clearly frustrated. Naiva let out a tired breath before leading Ryan toward the edge of the village instead. There, hidden beneath a wooden shelter, sat several strange machines unlike anything else he had seen since arriving. They looked ancient but carefully maintained, combining polished metal, crystal lenses, and carved stone gears. Ryan slowly circled one of them. "This is engineering," he whispered to himself. "Somebody built all of this." He carefully examined a cracked power conduit running beneath one device. Tiny blue sparks flickered every few seconds before fading. The failure pattern looked familiar. It reminded him of damaged emergency generators he had repaired during hurricanes back on Earth. Ryan looked toward Naiva. "Can I try?" She hesitated before giving a cautious nod. Using only simple hand tools from his emergency kit and materials already scattered nearby, Ryan removed the damaged section, cleaned away mineral buildup, and reshaped a copper connector until it fit securely against the crystal housing. The machine remained silent for one long second. Then soft blue light flowed through every channel at once. Nearby crystals glowed brighter. Small water pumps hidden beneath the shelter quietly came back to life. Several women stopped what they were doing and stared in disbelief. Ryan stepped back, wiping dirt from his hands. "It is not magic," he said with an embarrassed smile. "Machines always tell you what is wrong if you are patient enough to listen." Of course, nobody understood the words. Yet something changed in their expressions. They no longer looked at him as a helpless survivor who had fallen from the sky. They looked at him as someone who solved problems nobody else could. As the morning wore on, more villagers quietly approached, bringing broken tools, damaged equipment, and cracked farming devices for him to inspect. Ryan accepted each one without complaint. Helping people felt normal. It reminded him of home. He almost forgot he was stranded on another world until the distant horns sounded again, louder this time than ever before. Every face turned toward the western ridge. This time, through a break in the trees, Ryan could finally make out several unfamiliar figures moving slowly beneath the rising smoke. Here is the next part as a reusable draft. The figures emerged from the morning haze one careful step at a time. Ryan narrowed his eyes, expecting soldiers or wild creatures, but what he saw instead looked like a small group of exhausted travelers. Their clothing was torn, their carts overloaded, and several children walked close beside them. Even from a distance, he could tell they were frightened. The women around him did not relax. The armored warrior who had challenged his presence earlier immediately signaled her scouts to spread out along the tree line. Naiva remained beside Ryan, watching the approaching strangers with quiet concern. As the group reached the outer clearing, one elderly woman from the travelers stepped forward with both hands raised. She spoke rapidly in the local language, her voice trembling. Ryan could not understand the words, but he understood the emotion. She was asking for help. Several village elders gathered around her. Their conversation grew tense. The travelers repeatedly pointed back toward the western forest while drawing shapes in the air that suggested towering structures or machines. One young girl burst into tears before another woman gently held her close. Ryan shifted his weight. Something chased them, he whispered to himself. Or something forced them to leave. The armored warrior glanced toward Ryan, as if sensing he had reached the same conclusion. She still did not trust him, but she no longer ignored his presence either. Moments later, Naiva knelt in the dirt once again. She drew two villages separated by hills, then crossed one of them out with a slow motion of her hand. Ryan frowned. Gone. She nodded. Then she drew several straight lines unlike anything he had seen in the local architecture. They looked organized, mechanical, almost industrial. Ryan felt a chill settle across his shoulders. Whoever these newcomers feared was not simply another tribe hunting for resources. Their movements suggested planning. Their equipment suggested technology. As the travelers were welcomed inside the village walls, Ryan quietly climbed the nearest observation platform built into an enormous tree. From there he could finally see beyond the forest canopy. Far to the west, several thin columns of smoke rose into the sky. They were spaced almost evenly apart. Ryan's rescue experience immediately recognized the pattern. Natural fires did not usually spread in perfectly measured intervals. Somebody had made those fires. Somebody was advancing methodically across the landscape. He climbed back down and found a smooth piece of wood near one of the workshops. Using charcoal from a cooking fire, he quickly sketched the smoke columns exactly as he had seen them. Then he connected them with straight lines. Naiva studied the drawing. Her eyes widened. Ryan pointed toward the western horizon. They are moving this way. Although she could not understand every word, she clearly understood the picture. Within minutes, the sketch was being passed among the village elders. The armored warrior stared at it for a long time before looking back toward Ryan. For the first time since he had arrived, she gave him a small, respectful nod. It was not friendship. It was acknowledgement. Ryan looked around the village as children helped the new arrivals unload what little they had managed to save. He suddenly realized these people had accepted complete strangers without hesitation, even while danger approached their own homes. Back on Earth, he had seen communities do the same after hurricanes and wildfires. Decent people always found room for those who had nowhere else to go. Quietly, almost without thinking, Ryan made a decision. Until he found a way home, this village would not face whatever was coming alone. Here is the next part as a reusable draft. By sunset, the entire village had transformed. The peaceful settlement Ryan had walked into 2 days earlier now moved with quiet purpose. Food was being stored inside underground chambers. Water containers were lined up near every home. Lookouts climbed into the tallest trees carrying polished crystal lenses instead of weapons. Ryan stood beside the repaired water system, watching everyone work together without a single shouted order. "They have done this before," he whispered. Naiva looked at him, recognizing only her own name when he spoke it. She smiled politely before handing him another carved tablet. This one showed a circle surrounded by smaller circles, each connected with narrow paths. Ryan studied it for a moment before understanding. The village was not alone. There were other settlements hidden throughout the forest. Several of them had already gone silent. He slowly looked back toward the western horizon. The smoke had grown thicker. Whatever force was advancing was not wandering. It was moving with intention. Ryan asked for another piece of charcoal. Kneeling on the stone floor, he began drawing a much larger map than before. He marked the village, the smoke columns, nearby hills, rivers, and the narrow valleys he had noticed while climbing the observation tree. Then he drew several arrows that curved instead of pointing straight ahead. Naiva watched carefully. Soon the armored warrior joined them, folding her arms as Ryan continued sketching. He tapped the narrow valleys. If I wanted to move a large group without being seen, I would use these. He pointed to the ridges. These are your eyes. Then he tapped the village itself. This should never become the battlefield. Neither woman understood his words, yet both studied the simple drawings. The warrior crouched beside him, picked up another piece of charcoal, and added symbols marking hidden footpaths only local hunters knew about. Ryan smiled. Exactly. It was the first real conversation they had managed to have without sharing a common language. Before long, several experienced hunters gathered around the growing map. Ryan demonstrated simple hand signals he had learned during search and rescue operations. Stop. Wait. Fall back. Circle around. At first the gestures seemed strange to them, but after repeating the sequence a few times they immediately grasped the idea. Orders could travel without voices. One young huntress laughed after correctly repeating the signals. Soon several others practiced them together, quietly moving between trees without making a sound. The armored warrior watched them for a long moment before looking at Ryan again. This time she placed a closed fist against her chest in a respectful salute. Ryan returned the gesture without fully understanding its meaning. I guess that means we are making progress. As darkness settled over the forest, Queen Lysera finally appeared for the first time since Ryan had entered the village. She walked through the gathering without guards forcing anyone aside. The people simply made room because they trusted her. She paused beside the large map on the ground, studying every line Ryan had drawn. Her eyes lingered on the curved arrows leading away from the village. She looked at Ryan and asked a quiet question. He understood only one word. Koresh. It was the same word he had heard on his first day. Ryan gave an uncertain smile and shook his head. I still do not know what that means. Queen Lysera held his gaze for another moment before gently placing her hand over the drawing of the village. Then she pointed at him, not like someone giving a command, but like someone placing responsibility into another person's hands. Ryan felt the weight of that simple gesture settle deep in his chest. He had come here hoping only to stay alive until rescue arrived. Somehow, without ever planning it, strangers had begun trusting him with the safety of the place they called home. Here is the next part as a reusable draft. Ryan woke before sunrise, unable to shake the feeling that time was running out. The village was quiet except for the soft footsteps of the night watch changing shifts. He walked alone to the observation platform, carrying a small cup of hot tea Naiva had left outside his room. From the top of the ancient tree, he could see the forest stretching for miles beneath the pale morning light. The smoke columns were closer, much closer. He estimated they had advanced nearly 5 miles since yesterday. Whatever force was moving through the western valleys was keeping a steady pace without stopping. Ryan took a slow breath. That is not random, he said to himself. That is a schedule. As he climbed down, Queen Lysera was already waiting beside the large map they had drawn together. Around her stood Naiva, the armored warrior, and several village elders. They looked at Ryan the moment he approached. No one spoke. They simply waited. Ryan picked up a piece of charcoal and drew a long line behind the advancing markers. Then he circled several narrow valleys once again. He pointed first to the western edge of the map and then to the nearest stream. If they are organized, they need water. They need supplies. They will stay on the easiest routes. He sketched several fallen trees across one trail and a series of warning fires along another. Slow them down. Watch them. Never let them choose where the next meeting happens. The elders followed every movement of his hand. Even without understanding his language, they understood planning. The armored warrior added several hidden paths only hunters knew existed. Ryan nodded with approval. Perfect. If they cannot predict where you are, they have to waste time looking. Throughout the day, the village worked together with remarkable discipline. Small scouting teams quietly disappeared into the forest carrying food, water, and signaling crystals. Others strengthened bridges, concealed supply caches, and marked safe routes for families if they needed to leave quickly. Ryan spent most of the afternoon helping reinforce simple wooden structures using ideas borrowed from emergency disaster response back on Earth. Nothing he built was complicated. He simply added stronger supports where pressure collected and removed weak points before they failed. The villagers watched carefully, repeating every technique until they no longer needed his guidance. Late in the afternoon, the armored warrior approached carrying one of Ryan's original sketches. She pointed toward herself, then repeated several hand signals he had taught the hunters the night before. Stop. Wait. Circle. Fall back. Ryan smiled. You have it. She returned the smile for the first time. It was small, but genuine. Their conversation still contained almost no shared words, yet somehow they understood each other better than many co-workers Ryan had known back on Earth. As the sun began to disappear behind the mountains, Queen Lysera invited Ryan to walk beside her through the village. Children who had hidden from him only days earlier now waved as he passed. Several women thanked him in their own language, placing a hand over their hearts. Ryan felt strangely embarrassed. I have not really done anything, he murmured. You are the ones protecting each other. Lysera stopped beside the great stone crown standing at the center of the settlement. She rested one hand against the weathered carving before looking toward Ryan. Then, very slowly, she spoke one word in careful, unmistakable English. Koresh. Ryan blinked in surprise. She smiled softly before placing her hand over her own heart, then gently touched his shoulder. At that moment, Naiva stepped beside them carrying the carved tablet from several nights earlier. She pointed at the ancient crown, then at Ryan. Finally, she spoke in slow, practiced English she had clearly spent hours learning. Koresh means the one who carries hope when fear arrives. Ryan looked from the stone crown to the faces surrounding him. For the first time since crashing onto this world, he understood they had never been searching for someone to rule over them. They had been waiting for someone willing to stand beside them. The next morning arrived with something Ryan had almost forgotten existed. Silence. The smoke on the western horizon had stopped advancing. Scouts returned one by one, speaking excitedly as they gathered around Queen Lysera. Even before Naiva had translated through gestures and the few English words she had learned, Ryan could read the relief on every face. The routes through the valleys had remained empty throughout the night. The careful preparations, the hidden paths, the early warnings, and the willingness of neighboring villages to work together had bought them something priceless. Time. Ryan leaned against the repaired water wheel and let out a slow breath he did not realize he had been holding for days. He looked up at the sky, wondering if somewhere beyond those clouds another human ship was searching for him. He still missed home. He still missed Colorado mornings, strong coffee, and hearing English without having to think about every word. But for the first time since the crash, the ache in his chest no longer came from fear. It came from realizing that home was beginning to mean more than one place. Several weeks passed. The village slowly returned to ordinary life. Children laughed in the streets again. The gardens filled with fresh crops. The broken machines Ryan had repaired continued running without trouble, and the younger builders had already improved several of his designs with ideas of their own. That made him smile more than anything else. They were no longer copying him. They were creating something new together. One quiet afternoon, a familiar sound echoed across the valley. It was not the deep warning horn this time. It was a steady electronic pulse. Ryan froze. His emergency receiver, silent since the day of the crash, blinked with a tiny green light. He grabbed it with both hands. A weak automated signal repeated through static. Human search beacon detected. Rescue vessel entering high orbit. Please transmit location. Ryan closed his eyes for a moment. They had found him. He looked toward the sky, then toward the village where children chased one another around the great stone crown. News spread quickly after the villagers saw his expression. Queen Lysera walked over quietly and looked at the blinking receiver in his hands. She understood immediately. Home, Naiva said softly in careful English. Ryan nodded. Yes, home. No one asked him to stay. No one begged him to leave. Queen Lysera simply smiled and said, "A true Koresh does not belong to one people. Hope travels." Ryan laughed quietly. "That sounds like something my grandfather would have said." 2 days later, a rescue shuttle descended into the valley. The crew rushed toward Ryan, relieved to find him alive after weeks of searching. As they prepared for departure, Ryan turned back one last time. The villagers stood together beneath the ancient stone crown. The armored warrior raised a closed fist against her chest. Naiva smiled through tears she did not try to hide. Queen Lysera simply nodded, confident they would meet again someday. Ryan returned the same salute before stepping aboard the shuttle. As the ship climbed above the clouds, he looked down at the forest growing smaller beneath him. He realized something that no survival manual had ever taught him. Strength was never about standing alone. The strongest people he had ever met were the ones willing to trust a stranger, learn from someone different, and offer kindness before certainty. Long after Earth welcomed Ryan Carter home, he often found himself looking up at the night sky. Friends would ask whether the stories about the distant planet were true. Ryan always answered the same way. "I did not save them. We saved each other." And whenever he remembered the meaning of the word Koresh, he smiled, because he finally understood that the greatest leaders are not the ones who wear crowns. They are the ones who quietly give other people a reason to hope.